This week's Parsha begins with the barrenness of Rivka and the subsequent birth of the twins Yaakov and Esav, and most of the Parsha deals with the conflict between Yaakov and Esav. However, there's one parak of this week's Parsha, parak Chavav, that's focused entirely on the character of Yitzchak, and that is what I would like to speak about. Yitzchak, if we were generally to paint a picture of him in Tanakh, is not the most exciting character. He comes across actually as incredibly passive. 2 weeks ago, we read the story of Akedat Yitzchak, in which Yitzchak is lying there helpless, bound on an altar, about to be sacrificed. And last week, we read the quite exciting story of the acquisition of a wife for Yitzchak, except for that Yitzchak is not actually a character in the story of the acquisition of his own wife. He's completely absent from that story. The only place in the Torah where we find Yitzchak really actively engaged is in this week's Parsha, in Parak Chavav. And in Parak Chavav, we have 3 different stories of Yitzchak. Story number 1. There's a famine in the land, and Yitzchak travels to the territory of the Plishtim. The Plishtim men inquire after his wife Rivka, and Yitzchak insists she is his sister in order to save himself. When Avimelech, the king of the Plishtim, finds out about this ruse, Avimelech offers his protection to Yitzchak and Rivka. The story should sound quite familiar to us because it happened to Abraham, twice actually. Once when Abraham insists to Paro that Sarai is his sister, and the second time when he makes that claim to Avimelech. And the Torah itself actually invites us to compare the wife-sister story of Abraham to the wife-sister story of Yitzchak when it opens in Pasuk Aleph of Parak Chavav. Vahi ra'av ba'aretz milvad harav harishon asher haya b'yemei Abraham. There was a famine in the land aside from that first famine that happened in the days of Abraham. And indeed, there are many similarities in the wife-sister stories between Yitzchak and Abraham, except for that there's one major difference. Avram, when he tells Sarai to insist that she is his sister and not his wife, has thought this out, has planned, knows that he's entering a dangerous situation. Yitzchak kind of haplessly finds himself in this situation, and at the very last moment is able to pull out his father's tried and true line. That's story number 1. Story number 2, the digging of wells. Yitzchak prospers and needs to support his large amount of cattle, so he begins digging wells. And the first thing he does is he digs the same wells that his father Abraham dug, and he gives them the same names that his father Abraham had given to them. V'yikra lahen shemot kashemot asher kara lahen aviv. It's actually quite remarkable that the Torah goes out of its way to tell us that he renamed the wells the same names that his father had given to them. Then Yitzchak's servants begin to dig 2 new wells, and these wells are contested by the Plishtim. Their third attempt at digging a well is successful. Ve'achpor be'er acheret v'lo ravu aleha. Ve'yikra shma Rechovot. This third well is called Rechovot. Why? Vayomer. Ki ata hirchiv Hashem lanu ufarinu ba'aretz. Because now God has widened us, has broadened us, and we have become prosperous in the land. Story number 3. Hashem appears to Yitzchak and reaffirms the promise that Hashem had made to Abraham, that he will prosper in the land. Then, after Hashem appears to Yitzchak, Avimelech pays a visit to Yitzchak and reaffirms with Yitzchak the treaty that Avimelech had made previously with Abraham. What ties these 3 stories together, the wife-sister story, the well story, and the promise story, is that they're all about Yitzchak repeating the life of Abraham. Abraham is dead, and yet his name is mentioned actually 7 times in Parak Chavav alone. The Torah seems to be telling us that what makes Yitzchak great is not that he was able to forge his own way, but that he was able to walk in the path of his father. There's a special kind of greatness in being a transmitter of, rather than a creator of, a tradition. There's a special kind of greatness in being able to redig the wells of your father. And if we focus for a moment just on the story of the wells, we notice that Yitzchak and his servants are only successful at digging that final well, Rechovot, the one that affords them space, that broadens their territory, after they redig the wells of Abraham. Once we have a tradition, we can't forge out on our own without first going back, both literally and figuratively, to its well springs. The stories of Yitzchak in Perek Chavav leave us with a challenge, both personally and communally. Personally, all of us children, whether we are teenagers or whether we are adults, are perpetually faced with the challenge of how to accept traditions from our parents and still be able to forge our own individuality. And communally, as a Jewish people, how do we accept the burden of a tradition, live within it, and still learn to move forward and live our lives in the present? What the stories of Yitzchak seem to be suggesting to us is that there is greatness in learning how to be an inheritor, in learning how to dig old wells. Shabbat Shalom.